Good afternoon. I do see we have about 11 folks who are joining us virtually today for Director's Cut. We appreciate it. Just a reminder that there is the Q&A session up in the, or section up in the top of your Teams window. So if you have any questions, I see we have a couple that have come in already, which is great. Feel free to just post those. And we'll prompt those over to Lynn as we get started. With that, I'm going to pull open the Director's Cut, and then we will pass it over to Lynn. Lynn, go right ahead.
Hey, thanks, Katie, and thank you to everyone who's joining us virtually for this, the last Director's Cut of 2021. Of course, we'll continue to talk about 2021 for a couple more months because the December 21 production will come in February. So we'll still have a little bit to talk about. Let's talk statistics a little bit here, and then we'll talk a little bit of policy, and then we'll take questions. So statistically, production was really, really flat. It was down 3,700 barrels a day, which amounts to 0.3% reduction in oil production. Just a comment on that. Out of that 3,700 barrels a day, 3,000 barrels a day of that was on Fort Berthold Reservation. So what we know is going on over there is whenever we have natural gas impacts, it hits harder over there than it does anywhere else in the state, that being the core area and also at the far end of a lot of our gas gathering infrastructure. So that's the place where it hits the hardest, and so I think we're attributing the slight production decline, and in particular on Fort Berthold, to that. You'll recall that we had a series of maintenance operations on northern border through the month of October, and so people were warned about that, and they did a great job of meeting the gas capture requirements in spite of those reduced volumes that we could export on northern border. That also points us to the future that Justin often talks about, where unless we can find a way to expand our gas export capacity, we ultimately can end up limited on our oil production. Good news is that 1.11 million barrels a day still keeps us 1% above revenue forecast. So for those that follow the state revenue forecast, we're exceeding it by about 1%. New Mexico also saw a little bit of a decline in October, not as much as we did, but 0.2%. And of course, we track New Mexico because they're running roughly 100,000 barrels a day above North Dakota production right now. And the split between Bakken Three Forks and legacy pools has stayed steady now for many months at 96% Bakken Three Forks. So that's the great news along there. When we look at natural gas, if we scroll down and take a look, you can see that the decline in natural gas was actually even higher. It was about 1% in terms of natural gas production. And so that's a little unusual, but again, that's people responding to the northern border situation and restricting production on their highest GOR wells, which of course is around Fort Berthold and in that core area. So the policies we have in place appear to be working extremely well, as far as people understanding what the capacity limits are and responding to those and making sure that we stay within the fence line on that flaring. Just to touch on oil prices, they were really strong in October. So North Dakota's market was $75 a barrel. That's 50% above revenue forecast. So really, really positive in terms of revenues for the state, 1% above volume and 50% above price. You know that Omicron hit shortly after that in early November, and world prices dropped, but they're responding again, and so we're back above $70 for West Texas, and we're estimating that today we're at $69 a barrel and some change in North Dakota. So well above revenue forecast estimates going into the biennium. When we look at gas capture, great news. And when I get over the gas capture numbers, I'm going to have to issue some corrections. So I apologize. Somehow I didn't get those changed at the end. But gas capture on a statewide basis, 94%. And so we're well exceeding the limits that were set by the Industrial Commission. When we look at rig count, a little bit better. We're in the 30s now, but we're tracking New Mexico. They're at 88. And so even though a rig in North Dakota yields twice the oil production of a rig in New Mexico, we don't match in terms of a rig ratio. So we're going to continue to lose ground there. 32 is not terrible, and it's not horrible news. And I think one comment to that is I just looked at some oil and gas journal survey work that they had done. And they surveyed shale operators around the nation. Interestingly enough, it showed a lot of what we thought we had been seeing, that CapEx or capital investment in the Bakken was down 14% this year from last year. So 2020 to 2021 was a minus 14% for the Bakken, whereas it was about a plus 15% for the Permian. Now, the good news is that that same survey of Bakken operators shows that they plan to increase their capital investment 19%, 21 to 22. So we, in fact, are on track to start seeing that rig count march up and completions march up, and we should get back into a slow growth mode on production. Little discussion with one of our major rig operators. They've got 4 rigs that have been contracted to leave the yard in February. So that would put us in the upper 30s. They are struggling to get trained personnel to make that happen, but they've got a couple months to get that done. On the completion side, October was a good month. Came in at just 1 over the revenue forecast. So there again, we like what we see there. And November was a very strong month at 60. So with fewer rigs and 10 frac crews operating, what that did was we saw our duck well count drop by about 50 wells. We went from over 500 down into the 400s. So again, as we had been projecting, they're using a lot of frac crews to complete those duck wells and reduce that inventory. We saw a little bit of an increase in our inactive well count. That's kind of normal going into the fall. We'll be keeping an eye on that. We really want to keep that number below 2,000. That's an important benchmark for us. Record number of producing wells, new all-time high at 17,163, and some interesting information came out from a report that I followed that we're getting pretty mature in the core area, 80 to 85% drilled out, but in the tier 2 and tier 3 area where we're starting to see lots and lots of 3-mile laterals, and actually I had some conversations this week with an operator that wants to drill 2 4-mile laterals early next year. So we're seeing that technology applied to the tier 2 area, which actually results in wells that are just as good as 2-mile wells in the core area. And the tier 2 area is only about 50% drilled out. The tier 3 area is only about 25%. So there's still a strong inventory going forward. Talked a little bit about Fort Berthold already. We're up 1 rig, 1 on fee land, 1 on trust land. And we did see a decline in production there. In fact, the entire statewide decline happened on Fort Berthold. And I talked about rig counts and the fact that we're down 14% for capital expenditures this year, but anticipating a 19% increase going into next year. When you look at storage or oil stocks, it's a pretty sobering picture. So worldwide, we're in supply-demand balance. Still about 1.5 million barrels, I'm sorry, the world supply, there's still a lot of oil in storage around the world, but we're probably estimating a 1.5 million barrel a day shortfall in terms of production versus demand. So they're reducing that supply, and you can really see it in U.S. supplies. That's the first time in recent memory that we have been below the 5-year window, the 5-year average window there in terms of oil supplies in the U.S. So I guess I would say really enjoy the relief that you've seen right now in gasoline prices because it can't possibly last in that situation. Looking forward to the gas capture, and I apologize, I got to issue some corrections here. So the 94% statewide is correct. The statewide Bakken is actually 95%. And then non-FBI Bakken is correct. Fort Berthold Bakken is correct. Trust on Fort Berthold is correct, but the fee Fort Berthold side dropped to 76%. And Big Bend Field fell to 62%. And they have a new neighbor that's joining them in terms of a challenging area to deal with stranded gas, and that's Deepwater Creek Bay at only 71% capture. So those two fields alone are what's pulling that fee Fort Berthold number down. And we're really anxious to get in and work with some companies on flare mitigation technologies to see if we can't incentivize getting those flare numbers up. There is one other area in the state, and we just met with the operator this last week, Charleston Field, which is straight south of Lewis and Clark State Park on the south side of the lake. Gas capture is only 77% in Charleston Field, and there's a lot of undrilled well locations in there. So that's another area. So there's really 3 areas where we're going to try to focus our efforts to get some flare mitigation interest going. When we look at federal policies, I got to talk a little bit about Bureau of Land Management. So as you know, North Dakota sued the Bureau of Land Management to force them to get back on schedule doing their quarterly lease sales. The news there is that our court case is going to be heard here in Bismarck on the 12th of January. So be watching that. That'll be in federal court at the federal courthouse downtown here in Bismarck on the 12th of January. When we look a little further down the list, I think I have to go a ways to the EPA. Nope, to Congress. Okay, so let's stop at Congress. So the Investment and Infrastructure or Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act passed Congress. It was signed on the 15th of November. North Dakota has a deadline coming up here now in 13 days to apply, or actually to file our intent to apply for formula grants. What this is all about is they took a look at what we did with CARES Act money here in North Dakota. They wrote a nationwide program to give the BLM money, tribes money, states money to replicate that program across the nation and hopefully deal with the 60 to 200,000 orphan wells that exist across the nation in an effort to reduce methane emissions and also put that land back into productive use. So North Dakota fully intends to apply for the formula grants, which that grant can be spread over 5 years. The money can be spent. And we also plan to apply for an initial grant and some matching and regulatory performance grants that come out of that program. So stay tuned for that. We're pretty excited about the potential impact and assistance that we can get out of that. Finally, on the EPA side, Washington, December 14th, 2021. So the preamble for proposed rules to apply emission performance standards to existing facilities as well as new facilities was published December 14th. Actually, it was announced November 2nd. This information came out December 14th, that they've extended the comment deadline. That comment deadline is now January 30th. I would encourage you to comment. North Dakota is going to certainly comment. I'm sorry, is it January 31st? I think it's January 31st. So we've got about 6 weeks. Christmas and New Year's will shoot a big hole in that, but we've got about 6 weeks to submit comments. So what this would do is it would apply new, very stringent restrictions on emissions from not just newly constructed oil and gas facilities, but all of our existing oil and gas facilities. And so we'll be having conversations with our Department of Environmental Quality and also legal counsel, because there's still a case hanging out there where the state of North Dakota sued over the previous EPA rule that looked like this. We haven't seen the actual rule. What we have seen is a 150-page preamble that kind of describes what the rule is going to do. So we'll be commenting on that. That's everything I had in terms of statistics and policy. Be happy to take questions now, Katie.
Perfect. I do have one question that came in. How does the oil and gas sector look going into 2022? Do you feel $100 oil is a possibility in the future?
I think, you know, there are a few people that are talking $100 oil. Let me start with the first part of that question. It looks like we're going to have a strong 2022, at least in comparison to this year. So what we're anticipating is activity returning to first half of 2020 levels. You know, the pre-COVID problems that we encountered when we rolled into March of 2020. So we were down 14% in activity this year. We expect to be up 19 to 20% next year. So we'll actually see a really good year, I think, next year. Nothing like, you know, some of the late teens, you know, when we would see back-to-back 10 and 20,000 barrel a day production increases, but we're certainly on track to see that 1, 2, 3% growth in production as the year 2022 rolls out. Now, what I'm hearing from, you know, people writing about world production and the slow pace of OPEC plus adding production worldwide, and you know what you heard at the Doug conference and at the conferences in Houston, which I'm going to be going down there in February, and we'll see what has changed between now and then as Omicron does its thing across the nation. But what we're hearing from oil and gas executives is that the last 18 months we have way underinvested, and that what we're building is a supply shortage. So $100 oil is not out of the question. You know, we're in the low 70s if this keeps going and we continue to see underinvestment like we saw in 2021, it's definitely not out of the question.
Perfect, thank you. I also had some questions that had come in from Amy Sisk. One would be if you could give an update on oil and gas leasing on federal lands, any indication that lease sales are to resume in North Dakota, and any thoughts about federal leasing report that the DOI released a few weeks ago.
Yeah, great question. So first of all, they do have a lease sale scheduled for February of 2022. So we have every reason to believe that they will continue to hold those lease sales as they're directed by the Mineral Leasing Act. But we're going to continue with our court case to make sure that happens. So North Dakota is one of those rare areas where we've got this enormous inventory of unleased federal lands that have been cleared by the surface management agencies. It was interesting that in June of 2020, the Corps of Engineers issued their RFP or their plan for leasing Corps of Engineers lands in the state of North Dakota. And then December of 2020, the Forest Service did. And that added a large inventory. There is right around 800 tracts on the nominated and cleared list. So we should see some very big lease sales in North Dakota in 2022 and 2023. I haven't really fully digested the report that came out, but I don't think I saw a lot of surprises in there. When I worked on the Royalty Policy Committee under President Trump and the Department of Interior there was a lot of talk about the need to adjust royalty rates on federal lands and also to adjust lease terms to be more in line with what the states are doing. There's a great big disparity there, and so no real surprises of what came out there. There was somewhat of a tone that we should be doing less on federal lands. I would disagree with that, but then I'm speaking for federal lands in North Dakota. I think we do it better than anywhere in the world, and so if we're going to be the transition fuel that we all see Bakken oil and gas being, then we're going to have to lease those 800 tracts. But there may reasonably need to be some adjustment in the terms that Congress and the Department of Interior have set for federal leases.
Thank you. I had another follow-up question that came in, or not a follow-up, but another one from Amy in regards to the USGS report that came out this week. Any reasoning or on lower predictions that had come out in this newer report, or any updates, I guess, from our offices on that?
Yeah, well, just a very brief statement on that. And again, we weren't all that surprised that the number went down. I think we were surprised how much the number went down, but keep in mind how many wells were drilled and how much area of North Dakota was removed from the undiscovered category. So what we have to keep in mind is that the Bakken and Three Forks, as of the end of October, had cum production of 4 billion barrels of oil. It is still producing 1.1 million barrels a day, which indicates to us that from the existing well inventory, it's going to produce another 4 billion. And then add to that 4.3 billion of undiscovered or undrilled, and you actually have a pretty solid number, a pretty good number of 12.3 billion. And we think that's, on the lower side of what the ultimate number is. But so, a little disappointed in the amount of the reduction, but not surprised that it went down. We're doing a deeper dive into the analysis, and maybe sometime first quarter of next year, we'll get Tim Nesheim, our petroleum geologist lead, to join us at one of these webinars, and we can talk in detail about that. I think that'd be a good idea.
Thank you. And then the last question would be just a look back at 2021. Any overarching themes or anything there that you wanted to just comment on how 2021 looks for oil and gas in North Dakota?
Yeah, so to kind of sum it up, the industry began to recover from probably, one of the top three or bottom three worst years ever. 2020 was as bad or almost as bad as any other year that we've seen in oil and gas history in North Dakota. And so we saw companies emerge from bankruptcy. We saw companies get their cash flow back online, and we've seen a pretty decent recovery from the extremely low rig count and frac crew numbers that we saw this time a year ago. I think we anticipated a quicker recovery than what we saw, and so it's a little concerning. But there, I've talked to a couple oil company executives, and there are still quite a few uncertainties hanging over our head. What is the Department of Interior going to do with federal leasing? What is EPA going to do with emissions regulations? And what is going to happen with Dakota Access Pipeline? Because the new target date for the EIS from Corps of Engineers is September of 2022. So I think those uncertainties are tamping down the recovery. So to kind of sum it up, a moderate recovery from one of the worst years the oil and gas industry's ever seen.
Thank you, Lynn. I don't see any other questions that have come in yet, but if anything comes up, we'll let you know. Otherwise, I think we'll transition over to Justin.
Great. Well, thanks, Katie. Let me know, Katie, when you've got those slides queued up, and I'll kind of prompt you as we walk through them. I was excited to hear that maybe Tim Neschheim would be joining one of these events coming up. Tim, for those of you that don't know him on the call, is a wealth of knowledge, great guy. So I'm excited to see what his take is on that USGS report as well.
Okay, slide should be up.
Okay, perfect. So on slide 2, Katie, if we kick over to there was a slight uptick in production in that eastern Montana part of the play. They did reduce their rig count, though. They were at 1 rig last month during our report. They've gone back down to 0 active rigs, 0 rigs remaining in the South Dakota portion of the play as well. But overall for the basin, somewhere in that 1.16, 1.17 million barrels per day total system-wide for our transportation needs on the crude oil side. So slide 3, again, as Lynn alluded to, very, very minor changes in month-to-month. Again, we'll see as we start heading into winter, that always becomes challenging, particularly here in the month of December. December has a history for us in North Dakota of starting out sometimes on the mild side and then leaving a little bit more on the volatile side. So we'll keep a close eye on the weather and any potential impacts that may be having on not only production but gas capture as well. And I'll talk about that when we switch gears to the natural gas side. So on slide 4, Katie, taking a look at the transportation pie. The one area that did shift down noticeably was that truck traffic to Canada, dropping down to 1%. And if you go to slide 5, that is one of the lowest estimated percentages that we've seen in quite a number of years. Almost down to almost 0 reported northbound movements out of the basin that we'll touch on here in a second as well. Crude by rail on slide 6 has held incredibly steady the last several months, right around that 175,000 barrels per day on average. And I'll speak in a moment. I apologize to keep kicking the can down the road, but there are some things that may be shifting here that we'll keep a close eye on the crude by rail out of the region. So as far as the destinations of what we've seen up through September, continuing to dominate that PADD 5, that Pacific Northwest refining area. And again, I'll touch on a moment of why I'm expecting maybe we see some additional volumes headed that direction here in November and through December and January. On slide 8, the one thing that typically drives those marketing decisions is what the prices are doing at those refining complexes around the region. There was some disruptions up in the Pacific Northwest as far as crude availability that may, again, in November, December, January, be more influential even than the prices that you're seeing here on slide 8. On slide 9, just a quick snapshot. The one thing that you will notice has gone down. We had several months of really strong pricing at Clearbrook. Up until recently, it had dipped back negative below, so a negative net back to WTI at that Clearbrook market. It's just in the last several days creeped back up into that positive range, but certainly nowhere as strong as it was in that August, September, October time frame. And then when we look at some of the other major marketplaces, Brent 253 over WTI Cushing. So again, deliveries by rail out to the East Coast, I'm not anticipating any major changes there, as well as the Gulf Coast only being roughly, we'll call it $1.50 to $2 higher than WTI for that light sweet barrel. Again, I'm not anticipating any major draw for incremental barrels by rail down to that marketplace. So they'll continue to get deliveries down to Cushing and down to the Gulf Coast on DAPL. But as far as any extra market incentive by rail to those markets, I'm not seeing that at this time. So Katie, if you can go to slide 10, this is what I was alluding to earlier. Some of you on the call may be familiar with what has taken place in the last number of weeks, but in mid-November, the Trans Mountain Pipeline and the system that's currently active or was active prior to this was that black line that you're seeing. And so that delivers crude oil and some refined product, 300,000 barrel a day system from the Edmonton markets down to that Pacific Northwest, both on the Canadian side of the border as well as a number of refineries up in that Northwest Washington state. And due to some severe weather that had taken place in November, right at November 16th, I believe was the date they shut down that system. As you can see, that's one of their images on the top left. They had severe erosion and some concerns about the integrity of their system. To my knowledge, they did not have any major leaks or incidents associated with it, but the pipe was shut down for 21 days. It just went back into service, partial service, early last week. Some additional news this week was that they're not anticipating getting back up to full throughput on that system, what it was doing prior to the shutdown until possibly late January. And so when we think about not only deliveries to that Pacific Northwest and their access to crude oil, this system was really the only direct pipe connection to that Alberta supply. And then the Bakken as well supplies that Pacific Northwest portion of the U.S. With rail deliveries. There's also the availability for Alaskan barrels to come down by water and other foreign deliveries as well. But I am expecting that we may see a shift in transport starting in November and potentially continuing on through January with potentially some more crude by rail deliveries from the Bakken if those refineries in that Pacific Northwest need incremental supply due to the reduced flow and that shutdown that took place. When we look at slide 11, the other key part of how that may influence us and what we've maybe seen in North Dakota for the last number of weeks, when you look at that Edmonton market, you can see in blue, that's the Trans Mountain system that was shut down. And then also, whenever a region loses one of its key market transport systems, obviously that has a significant impact on what pricing looks like in those regions. So there was a price hit, not as severe as maybe some would have thought, but we'll call it $2-3 hit up in that Edmonton area, that influencing those Canadian barrels that travel down into the pad to the Great Lakes refineries and interfacing with those Bakken barrels through Clearbrook. And so again, I don't have concrete evidence, but that may have been one of the drivers for why we saw Clearbrook pricing go back negative in this similar type of time frame. It certainly did not help the situation. If it wasn't the key driver, it certainly was influential in how those barrels get marketed. And for those refineries in PADD 2 of the U.S., looking at again, what their supply options are, what the market's doing on pricing, and then again pricing all those connected systems accordingly. So we'll keep a close eye on this. We'll likely in the coming months start having more and more data and some clarity trickling in, and start piecing together some of the story here, and help us understand how things like this that occur up in the western area of Canada also influence us here in North Dakota. Then on slide 12, this is what I noted earlier. If you look at that black line, that is the exports that are reported through the U.S. Board Reports of Canada and North Dakota, and that again was down at levels we haven't seen in at least a handful of years. So again, with the availability of not only pipe transport as well as crude by rail out of North Dakota, I would not be surprised, especially now with the Dakota Access expansion and that availability, that maybe we see some trending lower on that export side for a more sustained period of time. On slide 13, Katie, switching gears now to the natural gas side. So as Lynn said, unchanged in that discussion about why gas is flaring in North Dakota. On slide 14, what I will note, we've had now, I believe it's 15 straight months of that, we'll call it the blue piece of this discussion, the percent of flaring from wells not connected to sales. That has been at 2% now for 15 straight months. That is going to be one of the, continue to be a challenge when you think about how to capture gas from wells that are already producing. They've lost their volumes through that initial production curve, and as these wells are aging out in that challenge, and when we think about some producers and with goals of having, in some cases, very aggressive gas capture targets where they're looking at potentially very low single digits to no routine flaring. Again, the industry is looking at that 2% and saying, we know what has to happen and what challenges lie on that, keeping the wells that are connected, keeping that gas flowing. But again, what type of technologies? Is it a traditional gathering processing, or are we going to have to look at continue to ramp up some of those non-traditional technologies to really get after that 2% that has been extremely sticky now for the basin for quite some time. On slide 15, Katie, taking a look at new wells selling gas and producing gas. We saw that red line again outpace gas connections, but again, whenever we see that, we like to hope that that's a temporary thing and that industry will catch up. If we don't see that occur in the next couple of months, then we'll get a little bit more concerned about what's happening on the gas capture side and the connections. Certainly winter does not help that. That's that last mile, those connections out to new wells, new producing areas. So we'll keep a close eye on that, particularly as we head through the winter time. The forecast you'll see on my natural gas slide is using the EIA update. The EIA has really held steady to some of their price outlooks for, call it, the end of 2022 into that 2023 timeframe, right around that outlook now for several months. They are expecting, at least in this December report, some downward pressure on prices before the industry balances out there. On slide 17, no major changes, at least since last month, on the gas processing side of the industry. The outlook, again, is because the price outlook in the long term didn't really change. Some of those outward production expectations also did not change. Katie will kick through slide 18 right to 19. Very similar trends as of late. About 75% of North Dakota's of northern border space is being used by North Dakota production. That's again that trend line that if you drew a line along that red path, as well as another line on that gray path, again, we're certainly going to be approaching in the next 2 to 3 years a point where we're going to need incremental pipe capacity out of the region. Slide 20, no big news necessarily on the gas quality discussion surrounding the Bakken. Again, we've seen here in 2021, particularly starting in that February-March timeframe, a significant volume of ethane being pulled out and being transported out of the state in its purity or Y-grade form for the sake of higher prices on the petchem side. And so that's been driving and continues to drive down and hold lower those BTU numbers on North Dakota gas exiting the region. And the last thing I'll touch on is on slide 21. The documents are now available. The new gas pipeline grant program, we did get approved on November 29th, the guidelines and some of the policy wrapped around that legislation that came out and what that grant program is going to look like. So the first deadline is for that Grand Forks portion for March 1st, 2022, and then May 1st for the remainder of that $140 million piece of the program. So we'll have more information likely at that March press conference, and then continuing on from March, through the end of 2022. It's going to be a real active time through this program as we look to again make decisions and see how this can best fit the state of North Dakota and the citizens, and as well as the folks that would be using that system. So with that, Katie, I'd be glad to answer any questions that folks may have.
Perfect. Thank you, Justin. I do have one similar to what we had asked Lynn there towards the end. Can you offer any general thoughts on 2021 for some of the various energy topics or even some of this legislation, and any expectations for 2022 you might have?
Yeah, the one thing that sticks out to me is certainly on the natural gas side, and the seriousness of the industry to tackle and get extremely aggressive on gas capture in the state, and what that's going to mean long term for the industry, and what type of infrastructure needs it's going to take to stay on top of that challenge. So certainly for me, the thing about this past year was gas capture, and the understanding that today's infrastructure will not be adequate to address those long-term goals. And so we're going to continue to see investments at every phase of the gas sector, from the wellhead all the way to the burner tip, and everything in between is going to need expansions in order to see those aggressive goals met.
Perfect. And one question that came in, Lynn mentioned the need for flare mitigation into the Fort Berthold fee areas that have been struggling. Can you, Justin, speak to how much of a dent flare mitigation could possibly make in that part of the state, and how, if there's interest there in making that happen?
Yeah, so certainly the second part of that question was is there an interest? Absolutely. The challenge is not an easy one, and it's one that for years now has been at the forefront of a lot of the discussions, because you've got two things at work there. You've got incredibly productive acreage. Those portions on Fort Berthold produce some of the best wells in the state, but then the other reality is that, as Lynn said, those wells are typically at the tail ends of a lot of these gas systems, making it incredibly challenging for a traditional sense. So there is a very serious and press for folks to look at, will it be a hybrid of traditional gas gathering as well as supplementing with some of these non-traditional technologies? Will we see a push, even further to almost exclusive, non-traditional technologies for power generation and Bitcoin and all those other things that we've heard about in the last number of years? So again, very, very difficult challenge, and it's likely going to take a hard press on both sides, traditional and non-traditional.
All right, thank you so much. I don't see any additional questions that have come in. So before we end, just a reminder to folks that we have released the January Director's Cut dates. Those are posted on the Oil and Gas Division's website in the Information Center. So if you wanted to bookmark any of those dates on your calendars. And another reminder that in January, after the Director's Cut, after the standard portion of the Director's Cut, we'll also be doing kind of an update and a recap on CARES Act funds that were received in 2020 and how the work did with those funds. So that'll be in January. Otherwise, that would be all. Thank you so much, everyone.